Welcome to Sociology 395, Rural Communities, Legacy and Change. I'm Dr. Ed Kick, one of the instructors for your course, and I am a professor of sociology at the University of Utah. I'd like to introduce my colleague for the class, the other instructor, Frank Page. Frank, would you be kind enough to tell us all what brought you to the study of rural communities?
Well, I came to study rural communities for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is my concern about, ironically enough, about urban cities. I'm concerned about some of the negative consequences associated with our cities, associated with industrialization and modernization. As you know, many of our cities are marred by crime, pollution, and in general, the 20th century is just not everything it's cracked up to be. From a personal standpoint, I grew up in Holiday, Utah, which is now a large suburb. But during the 50s, when I was a child, that was basically farmland. And my father used to put me on the back of a horse there, and I'd spend my afternoons riding in the foothills. And they were marvelous, wonderful, magical times, filled with mystery and excitement. And I was close to nature. I could get lost, and consequently I had a chance to find myself here and there. Well, I don't think those kind of experiences are readily available anymore, and I think they're important. What I don't want to see is the urbanization of the entire planet. I don't want to see the planet turn into something like Los Angeles with sprawling suburbs and slums. Moreover, I think there are some critical, very critical ecological problems that come to roost in concerns about what to do with rural areas. There's a lot of data out now that says that, in fact, we're using up valuable farmland to build suburbs. And considering the fact that many people, many experts now are saying that we can't feed our burgeoning population, this in itself is a problem. That's compounded by the fact that agribusiness often relies on machinery which exploits the land. Consequently, people like Wendell Berry argue that for every bushel of wheat that you get from the breadbasket, 1 bushel of topsoil is lost. In addition to that, there are horrendous problems concerning other resources, concerning water. Right now, we're building cities in areas that can't sustain the population. Large megacities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, are being built in places that literally can't sustain those populations. We're facing some big problems. Water is a critical resource. When it gets to the point where water is being sold, we're going to have some big problems. And those are my general concerns. More than that, I'd like to say that, in a sense, in terms of master trends, I think what happens to rural America is what's going to happen to us. And consequently, I think we have a lot to consider.
You know, Frank, I appreciate both your romanticism and your cynicism. It's a bit ironic that I grew up 1,500 miles away from Salt Lake City in a suburb of Chicago, but shared many of the experiences that you had as a youngster myself. Went to a 2-room schoolhouse, had the same teacher for grades 1 through 4, all a very bucolic type of environment, the type of thing that most of us look back on and wish that we had again. And indeed, in my own life, I've tried to enact that by having horses for my own children so they can go through that, even though they live in an increasingly large metropolitan setting in Salt Lake City, Utah. In my own life, I've lived in other places where the rural community is about ready to go under because of economic distress. I've lived in other thriving rural communities and lived in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, which both then and now is a city experiencing rapid social change and in fact is an exemplar for much of the rest of the country. The key thing that I have witnessed is the substantial differences in ways in which communities react to social change that impacts them. Some survive, some do not. And what I wonder, and what I think the students should wonder in this class, is whether there's some sort of pattern to all of this, a sociological pattern. And I think that, as we will soon address for the students, there is indeed one, and that is one related to the sociological imagination, the ability of us as sociologists, as students of sociology, to theorize about the many possible causes that move communities in one direction or another, theorize and make choices through the availability of data about which theory really optimally suits what it is that we observe in our environment, what makes a Libertyville, Illinois, what makes a Holiday, Utah what they are, and what makes them change in a direction that either leads to their prosperity or, in a worse situation, their death. And as you know from the series itself, we'll be examining a large number of towns that either survive or die for various sociological reasons. I think it's time to let the students in on this sociological imagination that I keep referring to. I think it's time to review a bit of introductory sociology and to talk about one of the grand masters who discusses both the sociological imagination and megatrends within sociology, and that is C. Wright Mills, a conflict sociologist who lived several decades ago, but whose materials are equally important today. So let me turn that over to you, Frank, and with a thanks, and with the hope for the students that they enjoy the course as we go through it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Frank Page. Today I'm going to talk to you about the sociological imagination. Before I do that, though, I would like to talk to you about sociology in general. Just what is sociology? In my years of studying sociology, I've come across numerous definitions. Some are more abstract, scientific than others. Many definitions talk about sociologists as studying society, and society being a group of people that interact in consistent ways, a group of people that share a common culture, a common geographical area. And what I would like to say today is that these definitions are useful and workful, but I think fundamentally what sociologists study is the fact that from the cradle to the grave, human beings depend upon other people. We depend upon them directly, indirectly. We depend upon their labor. We depend upon the things that they create, the institutions that they create. We depend upon the legacies that they leave us. It's kind of like the old adage, how many people does it take to fly an airplane? Surely it takes a pilot, but then again, it also takes a ground crew. It takes people on the radar screens. It takes people manning the airport. It takes engineers and scientists. It's predicated upon the contributions of people long since dead, for that matter. So what I want to emphasize is the fact that sociologists study the fact that we do depend upon other people. And how would life be without this cooperation and the support and the institutions? Consequently, what sociologists study is the relationship between the individual and society, or what we call the social order. The classical theorists, people like Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, C. Wright Mills, they have emphasized this relationship between the individual and society. In many ways, they've argued that it's inescapable. For Charles Cooley, it's organic. When C. Wright Mills talks about the sociological imagination, essentially he's talking about studying this relationship between the individual and the nature of our society, our social order. When Mills talked about the role of the student, the intellectual, he said it's the job of the intellectual to address the malaise, the variety of forces, social, historical, political, economic, that influence the individual, and describe them in such a way that we can make sense of them. We can see their impact upon the lives of human beings. If we can do this, we can formulate problems from which we can formulate public policies. Essentially, in studying this relationship between the individual and society, Mills is talking about contextualizing in terms of broader influences that lie behind what individuals do. Understanding the relationship between behavior, feelings, perspectives, things like self-esteem, and the nature of our society, the nature of our social order. Here he's talking about understanding what people do in terms of social facts, things like social stratification, ideology, political institutions, authority, class, globalization, technology. If we can do this, we can see the difference between a truly personal problem and a problem that has its roots in the social order, a problem that can be understood only when a person understands his or her position in the social order and something about our society. For Mills, to utilize the sociological imagination, he argues that sociologists should operate in what he calls the classic or classical tradition. Fundamental to this approach and fundamental to the sociological imagination is asking certain kinds of questions. One of the main questions for C. Wright Mills is asking, what's the meaning of this? What does this mean for the men and women and the children of our society? What consequence does it have? This is true regardless of what you're looking at, be it homelessness, rap music, unemployment, boat people, immigration, new forms of art, poverty, or changes in rural communities. Another question that Mills says is important and should be asked is, always ask what social, political, economic, historical forces are at work here. What's driving the course of events? Another and very important question for Mills was, what kind of people are we creating in our society? Are they happy people? Are they people that feel that they're leading meaningful lives? Are they creative people? Are they complacent people? Are they, quote, as he said, cheerful robots? The next question that Mills says that is terribly important in using the imagination is to ask, what groups of people have the power and authority? And what groups of people are thus influencing the course of events based on the fact that they do have the influence, the power, the authority? In addition to that, he asks questions about what kind of ideas are guiding our society, and where are they taking us? And have we evaluated these ideas critically? In all of this, he argues that we should assess things in terms of who is directing the course of events and who is responsible. Then, of course, he asks the question, what are the master trends? Where are we headed? What kind of people are we creating? What kind of an environment are we creating? And then, of course, what can be done? What ought to be done? Now, Mills wrote in the late 50s, well, all through the 50s, his assessment of master trends was not a terribly optimistic one. Mills saw the 50s as a time directed by historical drift and what he described as crackpot realism and organized irresponsibility. In all of this, he noted that there was no longer a relationship between power and knowledge. And in fact, powerful people were often not the most knowledgeable people in our society. Consequently, he was less than optimistic about the future and essentially wrote in some of his later works, like The Causes of World War III, about a failure of leadership, a failure of vision, about a cultural default. My question for you is, what master trends do you see? What's happening to rural communities in terms of the overall picture? Where are rural communities headed? What do these changes mean to you and the people that live there? What should be done? What can be done? What will happen if nothing is done? In your studies in this class, to enhance your imagination, I would recommend that you study your textbook carefully, emphasize the key terms and the concepts. They will give you a new way of framing these events that helps you contextualize, it helps you see the overall picture. In doing this, get a sense of what sociologists mean when they're talking about community. Understand what the economic base of a community is. Understand the importance and significance of stratification, of the idea of a legacy. In terms of stratification, understand some of the fundamental terms about class and some of the Marxian terms about class. Differences between the capitalist class, managerial class, and the proletariat. Understand the notion of capital. There are different types of capital. Emphasize these concepts, and it should broaden your understanding of rural communities and their significance and the changes that are happening there, and it should also help you on your midterm. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for that excellent introduction to rural communities, Sociology 395. Students, as you watched Frank present our first session in the course, you'll note that Frank adopts a somewhat more liberal approach than many of you might have. That's a classical interpretation in sociology, and indeed it is one half of sociology. During the course of this session, you will also see that there are other ways of seeing the world, but even those approaches, even those more conservative interpretations within sociology, ultimately hinge on the importance of C. Wright Mill's work, especially his work on the sociological imagination, because it is this imagination, as Frank points out, that defines the sociological enterprise. When Frank discussed the sociological imagination, one thing that you could have been thinking about, and one thing I encourage you to think about now, is what it would be like to turn a reality that we all take for granted inside out, to look at it a different way. Take a crystal ball and hold it in the air and turn it upside down and look at it in a different light. This is precisely the type of activity that C. Wright Mills would have you do as a sociologist, and precisely the type of activity we should do when we're examining rural communities and theoretical approaches to rural communities. Another critical point that C. Wright Mills makes concerns master trends, the most important types of global changes that occur not just in the United States, but around the world in an interconnected global village. Now, one of the things that I would like to discuss is how it is that we go about trying to comprehend these master trends. And for sociologists and for scientists in general, there are two major components to the inquiry that leads us to discover how the world works, and they are research and theory. And may I urge you to jot down in your notebook the types of definitions that I'm going to give you for each of these. First, for social research. This is the systematic application of the scientific method to verify or to refute theories, Now necessarily it becomes important now to define theories for you. Theories include the description and the explanation of a key phenomenon, or a set of such phenomena, Theory and research are intimately interrelated in all of the sciences, in sociology, and in the study of rural communities. They are intimately interrelated because each leads the other. On the basis of theorization, we conduct research to test the theories, and the results from our research guide us in the presentation of new theoretical perspectives. Theories are so critical that it's important to take a look at all of the components of theorization. And the very first one that I'd like you to take note of is concepts. Concepts. And a definition is appropriate. Concepts are the names that we give to worldly phenomena. Age is a concept. Gender is a concept. Stratification is a concept. And soon we will be listing a few more key sociological concepts to guide you through the class. Concepts may be interrelated, and when they are, they form hypotheses. Concepts may be interrelated, and when they are, they form hypotheses. So, for example, the concepts of crime and ice cream eating can be linked together. The greater the ice cream consumption, the greater the crime. Now that seems like an absurd type of hypothesis to a sociologist, but indeed some scientists have verified that type of linkage solely on the basis of the sugar content of ice cream. A more practical hypothesis is that broken homes generate crime, and that poverty generates crime. Both of those are far more logical types of hypotheses, which ultimately are based on the concepts of broken homes, poverty, and crime. And during the nature of this course, you'll be discussing these types of concepts in regard to rural communities, and you'll also be talking about the hypotheses that are put together by sociologists to try to explain social changes in rural communities. Concepts are thus the key building blocks for this course, and they are the key building blocks for both sociology and for science. We think it important to list a set of such concepts, and part of this is to help you remember from Sociology 101 what the key terms for any sociologist are. Another reason for doing this is so that you can have an interpretation for each of your rural community chapters that is based on enlightenment about how key sociological concepts apply to each chapter. Let's start first with the concept of authority. Authority. This is power that is widely perceived as legitimate, power that is widely perceived as legitimate rather than coercive. Rather than coercive. Another key concept, perhaps one of the most important for all of sociology, is culture. Culture. The beliefs, values, behaviors, and material objects shared by a particular people. Shared by a particular people. That's culture. Power. Power. The ability to achieve desired ends. The ability to achieve desired ends despite possible resistance from others. Despite possible resistance from others. This, of course, was a key concept for Max Weber, who we will be hearing about as we go through this class. Another concept that's important is role. Role. Patterns of expected behavior attached to a particular status. Attached to a particular status. Then social change. Social change. The transformation of culture and social institutions over time. The transformation of culture and social institutions over time. If there is one concept that clearly defines this class, it is social change, because that is precisely what happens in what used to be relatively tentative and stagnant community situations, but is now a situation of enormous dynamism, enormous social change. Social control. The process by which members of a culture encourage conformity to cultural norms. Social control, the process by which members of a culture encourage conformity to cultural norms. And I'm sure everyone has felt both the sting of social control and has exerted social control over perhaps other members of their family. Socialization. Socialization. the lifelong process of social experience, the lifelong process of social experience by which humans learn patterns of their culture, by which humans learn patterns of their culture. In other words, it is via socialization that we learn how to speak, how to act, how to think, how to react, how a community can come to be conceived of. Social mobility. Social mobility, another key concept, which is defined as changes in the position of people, changes in the position of people within a system of social stratification. And we'll define stratification very soon, but within a system of social stratification. All of us have some measure of social mobility during our lives. Our hope is to have upward social mobility mainly, but for many of us, downward social mobility is also part of life, and this is also the case for many rural communities. Next, social stratification. Social stratification, a system by which categories of people in a society are ranked in a hierarchy, Stratification is endemic. Stratification has been with the human species from our first day through present and across all societies. Social structure, a relatively stable pattern of social behavior, a relatively stable pattern of social behavior. So while we all have social change in our lives, so while rural communities have social change in their experience, there is also a social structure that defines where we're situated and where the communities are situated in more permanent social relationships. Our final concept is values. Values. These are culturally defined standards of desirability, goodness, and beauty. Of desirability, goodness, and beauty that serve as broad guidelines for social life. We hope these key concepts will serve you well as you pass through the course, and you'll note them in particular highlight in your course outlines as you turn to them. At this point, we'd like to introduce you to a panel of experts, the experts who created the Rural Communities course, and we'd like to allow you to see their introduction to the course materials. Part of what they say is a grand finale, what you would see after they had interpreted the bulk of the course, but we've decided to move that to the front so that you may have the best possible summary of course materials and the best point of departure for enjoying what we think is a very fascinating course. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the course.